And I think you may hear some more about some of these Coventry examples and others around a kind of more capacious sense of creative repurposing from our speakers. So I want to highlight a few emerging themes and questions. I'm trying to avoid spoilers. I don't want to tread on the toes of our speakers, but these are some broad themes to bear in mind as you hear from our case studies. So, as I said, we've been looking at those relationships between the creative repurposing of tangible and intangible heritage, how they work effectively together. We've been thinking about tensions between creative repurposing and more traditionally understood conservation. That was brought to light brilliantly by Rachel Delman in Coventry in the Broken Angel project, which did something rather different and something more than simply repairing a broken stained glass window in the cathedral. We're thinking about scale, relationships between the creative repurposing of a single building, so restoring, renewing, revivifying a single building, and a wider public realm. So questions to do with scope, scale, also around zoning. Challenges posed by environmental change and climate change, something we've really seen come to the fore in Barking and Dagenham, and John may tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. Participation, co-production, particularly around policy making and placemaking. The complexities of multi-agency collaboration, including volunteer communities. Specifically, we're attending to some of the exciting potentials, but also the risks and vulnerabilities around charismatic leadership or volunteer involvement. And that links into the next point here, sustainability. Always a question when thinking about urban renewal, when thinking about conservation, when thinking about regeneration. And finally, on this list, metrics for success. The quantitative, the qualitative, but also questions of scale again, success over what geographical range and over what chronological period? Where do we set the boundaries for measuring the success of these projects? We've also been struck by the need for avenues for sharing best practice across many of these different projects across the country. I'm sure we'll pick up some of these threads in discussion. This event is one stepping stone as we work through the project. It'll be culminating in an online resource. At the heart of that will be the case study work done by our brilliant researchers that you'll hear from in a moment. And we'll also be publishing a policy paper with recommendations around much of this. So that's it from me. Matt, back to you.
Thanks, Catherine. That's great. And if we can move swiftly on and invite John to kick us off with his presentation on his case study area of Barking and Dagenham.
Thanks, Matt. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, so as I've been introduced, I've been looking at Barking and Dagenham, somewhere that you might think at first glance isn't exactly renowned for its heritage. You might think I drew the short straw in exploring an area such as Barking and Dagenham in a project considering links between heritage and urban renewal. With 47 listed buildings, it lags a long way behind Coventry and Sunderland that you'll hear about shortly, both of which have over 300 listed buildings, and even its neighbouring boroughs have more than 100 each. But as Catherine mentioned, if we adopt a broader approach to heritage, then actually it does offer a really interesting case study for this project. So Barking and Dagenham is located in East London. It's bounded on three sides by rivers, the Thames to the south, the Roding to the west, and the Rom and the Beam to the east. It also has a long history of change and adaptation, from medieval Barking Abbey through to England's largest fishing fleet in the 18th century, 19th century industrialisation, 20th century urbanisation, perhaps most notably in the Beacon Tree estate. That estate was key in shaping local sense of identity. So a home on the estate and a job at the Dagenham Ford factory perhaps characterised local identity and sense of place until very recently. Fleeting electoral success for the BNP in 2006 reflected anxiety about the local consequences of regional and global processes being worked through at a local scale. But today, the area has a diverse population, and the local authority's draft local plan has ambitious targets to build 44,000 homes over the next 15 years. In terms of levelling up, Barking and Dagenham is a priority 1 area, perhaps in no small part due to its classification as one of the most deprived local authorities in London in the 2019 indices of multiple deprivation. Slightly more recently, the RSA's Heritage Index highlighted that the area has high heritage potential. So the physical heritage assets that do exist are not being maximised in terms of the way that they're used, community participation in their management and funding as well. That's not to say creative things aren't happening in Barking and Dagenham. A number of film studios are opening and relocating to the borough, and physical heritage assets have already been adapted for new uses. Most notably, I think, the striking Grade 2 Dagenham Civic Centre, which you can see on the slide here on the right, now being used by Coventry University. But I think more interestingly, in a lot of ways, in Barking and Dagenham is the creative repurposing of more intangible heritage. And there have been some small-scale attempts by the local authority to tell different stories about the area through murals and mosaics on buildings, and on the recent Bike Fest on the Abbey Green. But more significant, I think, is the work of the Participatory City Foundation and its Everyone Every Day project, which is working with local residents to co-design projects that help them feel more connected to their neighbours, to develop skills, even to evolve businesses. And its seasonal newspaper reaches 60,000 homes in the borough with each edition. The Everyone's Warehouse that they've set up in the south of the borough, and its emphasis on making, as you can get a sense of in the slide here, is building on the local sense of place and identity rooted in manufacturing that has existed for a long time. But in other ways, this project is taking a stand against conservative and exclusive notions of identity by insisting that all of the projects it develops with residents are inclusive. So everyone should be able to attend every activity and event that they organise. In doing so, I think it's repurposing stories about the borough and its history to create what they would call is a participatory ecosystem that aims to give all residents a stake in their area. In contrast to the Levelling Up white paper, it's not a nostalgic sense of local pride that they're trying to invoke, but rather a sense of local identity that welcomes existing and new residents in the hope that they develop agency over both their neighbourhood environment and the local community. I thought I would end because one of the most striking things that's missing from discussion about urban renewal in the borough, creative repurposing and levelling up is the impact of climate change. So the data crunchers at Climate Central predict that much of the borough will be below the annual flood level by 2050, using fairly conservative estimates. And so with that in mind, I think it's vital to ask whether creative repurposing might challenge the business as usual model of urban renewal, particularly when levelling up presumably doesn't mean lifting low-lying areas out of the floodwater. Thank you.
Great, thanks, John, and thanks for coming in bang on 5 minutes and for reiterating that need to take a broader approach to what we consider to be heritage. I think that's a theme that's going to reoccur throughout this evening. Rachel, if I could invite you to give your presentation next.
Okay, thank you. I'll just attempt to share my screen. Can you see that okay? Perfect. Okay, well, I just want to preface this very quickly by saying thank you to everyone who took time out of their busy schedules to talk to me during my visit to Coventry a couple of weeks ago. So especially Joe at Blue Sky City Walks, Aaron Law, Mike Tooby on the Broken Angel project, Heather and Catherine at Sitting Rooms of Culture, and all the artists and members of the general public who spoke to me too and were extremely generous. So my case study, as you've guessed already, is Coventry, which has been a city since the 14th century, and it sits on the River Sherborne and is the second largest city in the West Midlands after Birmingham. Now, most people know Coventry for the famous Luftwaffe bombing during the Blitz, although in the 21st century, it's gained a bit of a reputation for being a concrete jungle and for its inescapable ring road. So every time I mention to someone I'm working on Coventry, they invariably tell me that they've been stuck on the ring road at some point, and we'll come back to that later. So a quick Google search on Coventry brings up the following anonymous quotation. Coventry defines itself over the Blitz. Since then, the city is pretty dead. Lots of empty factory buildings and sites. There's not much life in the city, no spirit except in the pubs. But Coventry's long been home to a whole host of creatives, the famous medieval glazier, John Thornton. After the war, it had a great deal of regeneration. And here we have Basil Spencer's famous cathedral, which simultaneously looks back and forward after the Blitz. And several renowned artists and architects were involved in this new vision for Coventry, including John Piper, Graham Sunderland, and Elizabeth Frink. And Coventry was also Britain's motor city, so it was home to world famous brands such as Jaguar, Triumph, and Rover. And it's also renowned as the home of two-tone music as well. Now, in 2017, Coventry once again sought to build on this spirit of creativity and reinvention through a successful bid for City of Culture status. And if you watch the video, the bid video, participants describe Coventry as the seed that's yet to grow and the chrysalis that's yet to open. And one of the key words in the bid document was notably reinvention. So this idea of renewal and reinvention is a constant thread. But what does creative repurposing in the city look like today, 1 year on from City of Culture? Now, the organisations or bodies involved in creative initiatives in the city are wide-ranging. They include Coventry City of Culture Trust, the City Council, Historic England, the Historic Coventry Trust, Coventry University, and independent organisations and individuals who are based around the city. And I'm sure there are more that I've forgotten, which audience members more familiar with Coventry can remind me of in the Q&A. But I have to say that as an outsider, it's almost impossible to navigate the sheer labyrinth of people involved in creative repurposing in the city. So this is something that we might want to come back to in the Q&A. Now, I saw a huge number of initiatives and projects during my visit a couple of weeks ago. But I've obviously had to narrow it down for this. And I have to say, this is honestly the hardest 5-minute presentation I've ever had to do. So I've decided to just focus on 2 projects, one of which Catherine's already mentioned, which is the Broken Angel project. And I've chosen these because for me, they flag up themes of impermanence and renewal, and also the idea of defining boundaries, which I've rebranded in Coventry's case as the ring road issue. I told you we'd come back to the ring road. So in 2020 then, vandals unfortunately smashed one of the panels in John Hutton's famous west screen window, which you can see here. And this is the symbolic and literal meeting point between the medieval cathedral and the new cathedral, and the damage couldn't be repaired. Now, rather than merely fixing the window, the cathedral commissioned independent curator Mike Tooby to in turn commission 3 artists to respond creatively to the broken window space. And the broken window space, I should point out, I hope you can see my cursor, is just down here. Now, the first, Anna Petters, who's coincidentally from Dresden, fashioned a fragment of the glass into a wing, which she then projected up onto the empty space. And you can see that represented on the left there. The second, Birmingham-based artist Barbara Walker took inspiration from saints' objects and etched a series of objects in the window relating to families and Coventry. And I particularly love this skateboard down here because there are lots of skateboarders around the cathedral and you can hear them as you're looking at the window. So there's this lovely link between image and sound. And Mike actually also told me that there used to be a sign outside the cathedral saying no skateboarding. So it's made it feel a bit more inclusive maybe for the skateboarders around. And then the third installation, which is just about to go up, it may have gone up already actually, is being designed by another artist who's been chosen by the Coventry carers who are also involved in the project. Now, as a curator Mike Tooby explained to me, the window is about forgiveness. So it's a creative way of saying, I forgive you to the vandals. And he described it to me as an act of ethical and spiritual repair rather than a specific moment of repurposing, which I think is something interesting we might want to reflect on. So these windows aren't going to remain, or these installations rather, aren't going to remain in place. And that's precisely the point. But I think that raises all sorts of interesting questions around change and renewal and temporariness and permanence that I think we can come back to. And I should say as an aside here that there are lots of vibrant creative projects happening in Coventry that are in buildings that are set to be demolished. Obviously, in this case, hopefully the cathedral isn't going to be demolished, but there are lots of other buildings that are set to be knocked down. So we may want to think about whether liminality provides opportunities for creative repurposing or whether it actually stifles them. Now, the second case study I want to mention very quickly, and apologies for the quality of these images, I had a few problems with uploading my images earlier, is Knowles Mill Park to the northwest of the city, which is just outside the Ring Road. Now, this was originally the site of a 12th century watermill, and now it's a park with a boating lake and a children's play area. And there are plans to build more housing in this part of the city. Now, this project's been described as an attempt to break the concrete collar of the Ring Road and to think about sustainability. So the boating lake at the moment is also being rewilded. And the focus of this project is really about linking up this suburb of the city to the city centre. So under this particular part of the Ring Road, which we can see here, you have nice music playing, which really took me by surprise when I came around the corner. There's a stage area that's been implemented. There's lots of new lighting, which you can see here as well. There are new plants, and there's also a climbing wall. So it's been made into this really sort of interactive space. And I have to say, it does really feel completely different to all the other underpasses that I went through in Coventry. But it's difficult to say, you know, how long or whether that will last as well. So some of the questions I've thought about with this case study are, where are the boundaries of Coventry and how can creative repurposing reinforce or redefine them? And also, you know, who's responsible for the upkeep of this? What happens when the music stops working and, you know, the lights are broken and the plants become weeds, for example? And other sites we may want to think about in relation to these questions are the Charterhouse and the London Road Cemetery, both of which are outside the Ring Road, but which are also currently being regenerated. So just to finish very quickly then, these are the key questions that I've taken away from Coventry and that I think we might want to focus on this evening. So what does success look like when it comes to creative repurposing, and how do we measure it? Should creative repurposing efforts look to achieve a permanent legacy, whether tangible or intangible? Is it impossible to achieve or implement a holistic vision of creative repurposing in a city? Who is or should be responsible for the upkeep or maintenance of creative repurposing projects once they're implemented? And are second cities like Coventry destined to remain in the shadow of their larger neighbours like Birmingham, or can proximity be an advantage? I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Rachel. That's great. And those questions are certainly things that we may return to and may even put that slide back up. I'm particularly drawn to the challenge of undoing works of 60s infrastructure and ways of putting back historic connections within the public realm. If we can move quickly on to Mark, if you're ready for us, Mark.
Thanks, Matt. So I've been looking at the Heritage Action Zone in Sunderland in the northeast of England, and in particular this group of buildings, which is at 170 to 175 High Street West. The Heritage Action Zone as a whole spans a large area of the city, from 18th century buildings near the port in the east to much later buildings that were a result of the city's gradual move westwards in the 18th and 19th centuries. This block at High Street West is roughly in the middle of the zone, and this photo from Historic England's archive shows the buildings as they were in 2017, and you can see how derelict they were at that point. They were built as 18th century merchants' houses, and then quite shortly after that, I think, became shops. The building in the middle with the curved bay on the first floor was an early site of the firm of Binns, a family-run drapers that grew to become a large chain of department stores nicknamed the Harrods of the North in the northeast and Scotland by the middle of the 20th century. Binns followed the city centre's move to the west when the firm left the site for a more central location on Fawcett Street in 1884. So these buildings at High Street West, as I say, were derelict for years. And by 2011, a developer hoped to demolish them, but this was blocked by the City Council, who later purchased the buildings. Refurbishment plans for them slowly started to take shape, and the potential for a collaboration between the City Council, Historic England, the Tyne and Wear Building Preservation Trust, and many others was one of the building blocks that made the Heritage Action Zone possible. So the council transferred these buildings for a nominal sum of £1 to the Building Preservation Trust. The trust works collaboratively with many community partners, and they identified the local organisation PopRex as a potential partner early on in this project. PopRex had started out as a spin-off of a local rock band, and their drummer, Dave Harper, was very keen to establish a platform for creative people in Sunderland, something that he felt had not been available when he was getting started. An early phase of this refurbishment project involved PopRex establishing a temporary cafe at 170, which is the building on the left. And this functioned as an occasional event space, including community consultations on the refurbishment. So consultation began in earnest in 2019 and included a series of heritage open days with small exhibitions at 170. 2 years later, after what proved to be quite a challenging construction programme, the refurbishment was complete. So these are the buildings as they are a couple of weeks ago when I visited the city. So PopRex opened a daytime cafe in the right-hand shop, that was in 2021, and a Whole Foods store occupies the left-hand shop with the blue frontage, and there's a small community interest company who've taken offices above that. The cafe also acts as a training kitchen, which gives opportunities for young people to learn skills in catering and hospitality. The middle building, which is the former home of Binns, has now been transformed into a multi-purpose event space. So there's a stage for music and small theatre productions, and gigs are taking place quite regularly. The space is also used for community events, such as circus skills training for children. I just want to talk briefly about challenges and prospects for this project. As two of the buildings in this small block are now a shop and a cafe, they are likely to rely to some extent on passing trade, but the location could be seen as presenting a challenge. So this map shows a very approximate area highlighted in red of where the main footfall is in Sunderland city centre. High Street West continues well beyond that area, but footfall tails off noticeably as you carry on down the street. The area around the buildings at 170 to 175, marked with the red dot, is quite quiet by comparison with the city centre. But it's also worth noting that there are other developments in the pipeline. The disused tyre shop in the adjacent block, seen in the middle of this photo with the blue and white frontage, that's scheduled for refurbishment, also by the Building Preservation Trust. That project might include affordable housing and has received 4.7 million from the Levelling Up Fund. And there are plans involving the organisation Create Streets to redevelop an area further up the street, just beyond the tyre shop building. That space is currently a combination of car parking and open green space, and the current vision is the creation of a new small-scale neighbourhood. So in that context, the buildings at 170 to 175 could be seen as leading the way in regenerating this part of the city centre. Indeed, some at Historic England see this refurbishment project as a first step in redeveloping a somewhat isolated part of the city centre, and that sense of isolation does persist at the moment. An area that was once at the heart of Sunderland and knitting it back into the city as a whole. So with these plans in development, it'll be very interesting to see how the area looks in 5 or 10 years' time.
Brilliant, thank you, Mark. I think having seen those presentations, I think you'll all agree that one of the exciting elements of this project is just how different the 3 case studies are and how they trade on the same sorts of issues, but move from the sort of very traditional kind of adaptive reuse that Mark's looked at in Sunderland through to questions of identity in Barking and what identity Barking wants to trade on in its regeneration, through to Coventry really sort of making capital out of its history as having that sort of set creativity. I'm going to hand over to our panel guests now and invite first Owen and then Catherine to say a few words about themselves and their perspectives on this issue. So Owen, if you could, yes. Mark, could you're not screen sharing anymore? Okay, great. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Matt. Yeah, I don't think I'll talk much about myself because that's not particularly interesting. Beyond to say I'm head of Levelling Up and Places Strategy at Historic England, which is a job title that means nothing to anyone, not very much to me, to be honest with you. But I'm here representing Historic England, and I'll explain just briefly why I'm here representing Historic England, because our role has built significantly over the last few years as an organisation heavily involved in place shaping. We've always done that, always been engaged in place shaping, but 3 years ago we started our High Streets Heritage Action Zones programme, with which the government entrusted £92 million to us to regenerate 67 high streets in England. And that's a grant that it's the largest grant of its type ever given to any organisation in the UK aimed at heritage-led regeneration. And so we are midway through that programme, regenerating, as I said, 67 high streets. And Rachel mentioned Historic England in reference to Coventry earlier on, and Coventry, as many of you will know, you won't really, was our demonstrator High Street Heritage Action Zones. And what essentially they're designed to do is to use heritage and use historic character as a way of attracting people back to those places, to making what were tired, dilapidated places with falling footfall vibrant once again, and doing that through both capital works, changing the look of the place. And when I say place, I don't just mean the buildings, but also the wider public realm, but also changing people's perceptions through an accompanying cultural programme, which again encourages people back to those spaces to look at them differently, to see them again not as a high street, the traditional idea of a high street that pervades at the moment as kind of tired. We're all shopping online now, we don't really need high streets, but actually as vibrant community spaces that attract people and spaces that benefit those communities because of that attraction. I should at this point, partly because Emily has just put something in the chat, also mention the great work of Architectural Heritage Fund, who are doing a parallel high street work, the transforming places through heritage, which again looks to regenerate high streets through regenerating heritage and through heritage regeneration, but is focused on community ownership and community management of those assets. And that sits very kind of hand in glove with our own work with wider high streets, and also the wider work, no problem, Emily, and the wider work of the government widely through its Future High Streets Fund. And that leads me very nicely onto that broader government work, because actually we're in an interesting time for places, in inverted commas, because we've gone from Towns Fund, we've gone from Future High Streets Fund and our own High Street Heritage Action Zones Fund, and we're now in the world of the Levelling Up Fund, and soon the bright new world of the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. Now, all of these things have two things in common. Firstly, they represent a substantial amount of investment in places, almost an unparalleled amount of investment of this type. It's not designed for a particular feature. It's not designed to manage mental health referrals. It's not designed to manage any particular feature of those places. It's designed to manage and improve the places in the round and how those local places perceive themselves. But not only is that, each of these funds reference culture and heritage. And that is hugely significant because it's not always been that way with these types of government funding. Looking back to the Towns Fund all the way through to UK Shared Prosperity Fund, each of them recognise that heritage and culture has a key role to play in regenerating places and making that regeneration sticky regeneration, keeping people and keeping money in those places. And that's also recognised more widely within the sphere of levelling up. Those of you who have had the joy of reading the Levelling Up white paper from page to page, over 330 of them, will recognise that heritage appears in there. Again, this kind of reference is fairly new. It's not always been this way. And so we have a significant opportunity in shaping large amounts of money to support historic character of places and using historic character to bring these places. So there's a huge opportunity to do that. And I'll end my very short introduction is that to say along with an opportunity comes a degree of risk, because you kind of have to get it right, because actually, and there's a lot wrong with how these funds have been designed. If heritage doesn't perform that function, doesn't achieve that pull of people and that pull of success, then actually this kind of funding, these kind of references die off. And hopefully we'll get onto a bit later, and Rachel mentioned it earlier in that final slide, is how we measure the impact of this kind of work. How do we understand not just the impact of the regeneration more broadly, but actually the impact of heritage and culture to that broader regeneration? And I'll stop there because I think that's 5-ish minutes.
Thank you, Owen. That's great, and thanks for leaving us with some big, broad questions to pick up, and for hoovering up questions on the fly from the chat, which sort of makes up for my slightly sloppy work in the chair. So if I could pass to Catherine now to speak a little bit about the 20th Century Society and their work campaigning to find new uses for threatened buildings.
Yes, thanks very much. Yes, so I'm director of 20th Century Society, and we're the statutory National Amenity Society for buildings from 1914 onwards, with no cut-off date. We're beginning to work on 21st century buildings as well. And we frequently do, although a lot of our work is about kind of responding to listed building consents that are forwarded to us through the planning process late in the day, we're obviously spending more and more time trying to get involved at pre-application stage and really kind of focus proposals to make the best of 20th century buildings. I mean, we've actually just had our AGM in Coventry, and I was really interested in, particularly obviously in your presentation, Rachel, and your comment at the beginning that, you know, for a lot of people, Coventry still is a concrete jungle on a ring road, and we, I think, have felt really frustrated, I think, by the City of Culture process and the extent to which that really hasn't majored on the post-war heritage of the city. And maybe if some of those projects that you were showing had been embedded further back in the process, we would have had a very different outcome from the City of Culture. I mean, you know, quite a lot of the best, well, the post-war development early stage buildings are currently threatened with demolition, and the Bullyard shopping centre, a whole swathe of the south side of the shopping, particularly the stuff that's from the 60s rather than the earliest 50s period, still all slated for demolition, and the fantastic Elephant sports centre, which, you know, even you can now buy cufflinks with the elephant on, but it's still slated for demolition, has a certificate of immunity from listing. And something is not quite happening in Coventry, which I find really frustrating. And I think it's really interesting to think about why that might be. You know, and it seems to me that there's potentially, you know, a really interesting story that Coventry could tell, that it's not just about post-war redevelopment. It is a story that's about reconciliation with Germany, you know, thinking about how you move on and rebuild a community that both wants to remember the past and move forward, and the cathedral being the ultimate symbol of combining the old and the new. But I think that's something that you know, that the whole of the town centre of city centre of Coventry in many ways exemplifies. And you know, I mean there are L'Havre, for instance, in France, which in similar level of destruction in the Second World War and then redevelopment by Paris, you know, the local authority have bought a flat and set it up as a museum. They've gone for World Heritage status. They are totally on board as that being an incredibly powerful and emotionally engaging story. Whereas, I mean, at Coventry, I mean, the HAS schemes are fantastic, but I was, you know, it seemed to me a real missed opportunity that with Coventry, the HAS scheme was a traditional row of dilapidated 19th century buildings, rather than trying to look at what the issues might be, were you to look at, you know, going into a something like Bullyard, which is a pedestrianised shopping precinct, single story units around an open space, a very different typology, but potentially a typology that has even more potential than the street to actually become a centre for community activity. You know, so I mean, I guess I've took away from your presentation, Rachel, the kind of sense of optimism in that both of those two projects seem to me to be the sort of thing that could have led to a much more nuanced and appreciative understanding and public involvement in that complexity of a post-war story. But they it kind of feels like Coventry, it came too late to majorly influence the City of Culture. It's not yet still late to you know, we could still save some of those buildings. It'd be perfectly possible to do a turnaround and rethink the future of Coventry, building on that very rich story. But you know, how much pressure and impetus and buy-in do we need before we get that kind of switch in mindset? It hasn't happened there. We're about to go up to Bradford, where the Richard Dunn Sports Centre from the 1970s has just been spot listed, and we're going to try and get in at a much earlier stage there to try and encourage really creative reuse projects for that building. So so I guess I'm speaking as someone who you know, I think we are really proactively trying to shift our involvement from coming in at a stage where we do feel that you know, we have less impact than if we could actually get involved much further down up front with how people really kind of propose in the brief for redevelopment and look at the sort of broad range of possibilities rather than trying to influence the outcome way down the planning system.
That's great, thank you, Catherine. I think that's a really sort of key point to finish that contribution on, is the point at which these interventions are made and the point at which it is sort of almost set in stone and change can't be implemented. Yeah. And thanks also for responding directly to the second of the case study presentations, and it's that response that we'll move to now. Your and Owen's thoughts really directly about the content and sort of broadening it out. I might start, if I may, by putting to you one of the reflections that I think comes out of all three studies. Is this question of permanence when it comes to more creative projects. We saw with Barking the potential for it all to disappear under the floodplain, and the projects at Coventry being relatively sort of temporary and ephemeral, and what's the future for those. And also in Mark's presentation, those sort of creative uses for those buildings really stand and fall on the commercial viability of the businesses in a stretch of the high street that isn't itself particularly commercially viable. So I wonder if you both might reflect on sort of issues of permanence when it comes to creative repurposing and those kind of reuse projects.
I think touching on the example of Sunderland, and you talk about the sustainability of the businesses that occupy that property and influence that has on the sustainability of the work on that building. I would look more widely and view the work in Sunderland as not a project that looks at regenerating buildings. It's a piece of work that looks at regenerating the place, and actually the two are inextricably linked. One of the benefits of bringing those buildings back into use, and also the accompanied public realm work, is that people are brought back into that space, and actually that in itself, it makes those pieces of work more sustainable. It changes those people's perception of that space. It makes them more successful or effective spaces. And so I think it's important not to just talk about intervention of particular buildings, to understand the wider place. And also I'm touching on some of what Catherine's just said, and making the point about the focus on the work in Coventry could have been better served elsewhere. And I think there is a point to be made there that actually we're also talking about opportunity and a degree of pragmatism as well. Is that actually opportunity only arises in certain places and for certain buildings, and we must respond positively when the opportunity is there, and they may not necessarily be the most effective place to be direct our intervention, but actually they're the place where that intervention is welcome. And that's not only opportunity presented by local authorities, but also by owners and tenants of those buildings. And that constrains much of our work, is actually the importance of partners who are keen to be involved, able to be involved, because not everyone is able to be involved, and also in it for the long haul. And I think that brings it back to the earlier point about like Sunderland interventions. It's actually looking for people who actually will be there for the long haul, as to give time for those places to be regenerated, because it does take time.
I would totally take that. I would totally agree with that. But I mean, what I'm kind of interested in with Coventry is why, for the local authority, they were more interested in getting you to come and look at something that actually is pretty generic to many cities all over the country, rather than saying, come with us and celebrate something that actually Coventry was amongst the first, and has the best examples of post-war pedestrianised shopping centres. And I think it's that more work clearly needs to be done to actually get the enthusiasm and the appreciation and the sense of possibility and energy around those post-war buildings. There's still a mindset that says, oh, here come the heritage people, let's take them to see those ones with the with the rusty gutters and the buddleia growing out. That's what they like, isn't it? I think it is really telling that was still. I mean, Coventry is an extraordinary place in that there it has that crazy street where it's regrouped all its historic buildings in the immediate post-war period, and I think that what I mean, I think we're talking about a huge range of different sorts of projects here. And Rachel, I mean, you didn't say what. So there are three options for the broken angel thing, which are going to be inserted one after another. And in a way, I'm sure that is something that made it more possible in a grade 1 building to, to have that kind of intervention without anyone panicking about it. I mean, it's the same way that we can tolerate or we enjoy the fourth plinth in Trafalgar Square, that we see it as a temporary intervention and something that we can respond to and we don't have to live with, and we're not permanently adding it to the ongoing story of that place or city. But I mean, what will happen after version 3 goes in? What happens? You've still got a missing window and a bit of John Hutton that can't be repaired. So is this a way of trying out 3 options and picking one, or I mean, I'm kind of interested in that.
Am I all right to come in there?
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, that was a question I had as well. So basically the idea is that this is a temporary thing, and it reflects the fact that, the city is constantly changing, and the installations then belong to the artist, and it's up to them what they do with them. So it's really not clear to me what happens next, as you say, which is an interesting point in itself.
Yeah.
Is that window then repaired? Does it open the door for future projects? What happens, and what happens to the memory of those projects as well? But Mike was it's interesting you used the fourth plinth example, because Mike said to me that it's like a sort of spiritual fourth plinth. So it's about forgiveness and the spiritual legacy, because it's a space of worship. So sort of interpreting those installations in a slightly different way, rather than a moment of creative repurposing. But if I can pick up on what you said about the bullyard earlier, I don't want to dominate the conversation with that, but I think that's a really interesting point that you made, because I nearly did include the bullyard as my example, because there's so much creativity happening in those buildings that are marked for demolition. There's an entrepreneur called Alan Denyer in the city, and he's set up like an arts collective in the Lytton Tree pub. So it's the old Rover factory building. It's an old man pub basically downstairs, and then upstairs there's just all these display spaces for artists. There's lots of creative things happening there. And then in the market, which is also part of the Bullyard area, there's sitting rooms of culture, which is a space for sort of health, arts and healthcare. So people
I've
can
seen
come
that.
and be involved in workshops and things. So it's really interesting, because have these temporary empty spaces. Well, obviously the market isn't an empty space, but that space in the middle is, given rise to this creativity, and created opportunities, or are they sort of stifling it? I guess that's what I was trying to get at with that.
Well, or is it partly that the future of those buildings is threatened at the moment, so they're short-term leases, and it's cheap space.
Yeah, and that's the anxiety as well, that a lot of people that I spoke to, they're very anxious about what the future of these things is, because they can't forward plan. And the elephant building came up time and time again. Everyone I spoke to said, we love this building. What's going to happen to it?
I think the elephant building is really interesting, because although it has a certificate of immunity, I felt when I was in Coventry last, the city guides and the people in the information building, as soon as I said that I was from 20th Century Society, they all assumed I'd come to see the elephant. And it's kind of become the most visual symbol of certainly of the post-war buildings.
Yeah, definitely. But it's interesting because it's not listed, is it? I think
no, it's got a certificate of immunity,
yeah.
so it can't be listed at the moment. And yeah.
But yeah, that and the Priory Visitor Centre, they were the two that everyone was very upset about, and nothing's being done with those two buildings.
Yeah.
Can I just come in on a related point? And actually, I'll direct this to John and Mark just to spare Rachel 5 minutes, but could equally answer by any of them, or all of them, in fact. I mean, Rachel and Mark made specific reference to kind of the different local voices. Mark talked about consultation. Rachel talked about the number of different bodies operating, how that complicated, has the potential to complicate. I just wondered how in each of those case studies, how those different voices were managed. I mean, whose voices for what should happen was listened to? Was anyone not listened to? What drove that narrative? Who defined that narrative of that place?
John, do you want to come in first and say a little bit more about Barking and Dagenham?
Sure. I think Barking and Dagenham's an interesting place to think through that issue in a way. There's a planning application has just been approved for some, I think they might be 30-storey tower blocks, very close to the Barking Abbey site and the church, which are all listed right in the centre of town. I think it's something like 1,000 homes. It's part of the local authority's plans. The local authority is completely dominated by one political party. All councillors are from the same party. The planning application for this massive development right in the middle of Barking received 3 objections, which is astounding to me, that such a big scheme would have such a visual impact on the place, overshadowing significant heritage assets, and yet there was very little comment, let alone opposition. So in Barking, I don't know. I think the work of the Everyone Everyday project in terms of developing or building on intangible heritage, they've taken very difficult decisions about what it means, what inclusivity means. So for them, all of the projects they run are all about making sure that anybody in the local community can take part. So they wouldn't, for instance, support a men's shed project, because a men's shed project, while it's valuable in some settings, isn't open to everyone. So there are efforts in Barking and Dagenham to create a space where people do have agency over their community, and that's something that's open to everyone. Whether that's happening in practice is harder to tell at this stage, I think.
And Mark, what about the Sunderland example? And I wonder as well, while you're addressing that, whether you might respond to Owen's points about the attempts to regenerate Sunderland sort of the place more widely rather than just the buildings, and even touch on John's question about gentrification. So, aware that the coffee shop in that row of buildings is aimed at a slightly sort of upmarket clientele.
Yeah, that's quite a package of issues, but I'll try and speak to those.
You can have 90 seconds.
With no repetition. I think to talk about the consultation thing first. I think that's a really interesting question, and actually it's not something I've yet had the opportunity to explore very fully. So I've a number of different organisations were involved in consultation. There's this project called Open Heritage, which is a kind of, with the recognition that the UK has left the EU, is an EU-wide project that looked at case studies in 6 cities, and the High Street West project was part of their purview. And I think they assisted in trying to sort of facilitate some of the consultations. And then I think there are others that were organised much more locally. But as to who exactly was consulted, and whether some voices were louder than others, or did everybody's views get taken into account? That's something I'd love to know more about, but as I say, I've not yet had the chance to fully explore that. Touching on this question about, you were sort of drawing the contrast, Owen, between, sort of refurbishment of buildings and thinking about, the sort of regeneration of place more widely. I mean, that was something that I was trying to sort of touch on towards the end of my presentation by sort of looking ahead, where you have, the adjacent block is going to be redeveloped, and the use for that is, not settled as far as I'm aware, but housing is one possibility. And then, this probably fair to say more speculative project at the moment to redevelop the open space immediately behind that block. And again, the projections for that are to develop a neighborhood with a particular slant of sustainability, community orientation, whether that would take the form of social housing or a mixture of housing types, I don't think is very clear at the moment. But I do think what is clear enough in terms of plans is that you have had a specifically building oriented project to start off with, which then has definitely sort of led to this, the next project, which is building oriented, but thinking more broadly about housing, which is, I think, an attempt to, in a way, expand a neighbourhood, because you have the neighbourhood of Sunnyside, which is kind of round the corner from High Street West. And it's very clear from walking around Sunnyside that a lot of work has gone into regenerating that kind of townscape. There's a large square that's been redeveloped. It looks quite recent. I don't know exactly when. And then this new, more speculative neighbourhood, I think the idea would be that would in a way expand the Sunnyside area. So there is very much an orientation, as far as I can see, towards, developing a new neighbourhood. And, obviously that would serve those particular buildings that have been redeveloped, but might then lead to a kind of spread, I can imagine, because this is very much a sort of an outlier of the city centre as things stand. But you can imagine, a neighbourhood supporting the development of more commercial properties, which might then sort of link up, to the top of the city, up the hill. So I think those things are definitely in prospect. And where I've been talking for quite a while, I haven't talked about gentrification yet. I think that is very briefly, I think that's quite a complex issue. Just walking down the street and looking around, this just particular block of buildings does feel quite isolated in terms of commercial opportunities, yet the coffee there is quite expensive. And when you consider the kind of, the economic circumstances of Sunderland, the fact that this particular area is in areas of very high deprivation, I think there is a question there about who these, just in terms of the retail developments there, who are they for, and whether there is a sort of sufficient customer base for that kind of thing. So that's a question. I mean, the broader thing about gentrification, I think, is probably too complex to go into at the moment. So I think I'll leave it there.
I think just before we throw it out to questions, whether Owen, you can touch on that, and whether there's a tension actually with this sort of tendency for gentrification to creep into these kind of projects but now we're in this sort of levelling up agenda. It seems that the two things are sort of pulling almost against each other.
I was really hoping you weren't going to ask me about gentrification, but thank you, Matt. Well, firstly, and I think referring back to the original question, I'm just going to open up to make sure I have exactly what. And I'm not sure permanence and gentrification are related, and certainly for our own programs, I think what we've sought to do to avoid that quite correct challenge of gentrification is to actually proactively engage in communities and actually ensure that what change is essentially community led, is actually serving the people who are there. each of our 67s had community engagement plans, and I say community engagement as opposed to consultation because they're two separate processes. Have community engagement plans to try and better develop a relationship with communities and with the change that's taking place. I think that is one way in which you avoid that brush of gentrification. I don't think for one second it solves the problem in all places, but I think that is essentially what we've sought to do to try to avoid it. But I will take Mark's very well articulated argument of it's very complicated, and so I think stick with that.
Thanks, Owen. We are rushing towards the end, and I know that Owen needs to leave pretty promptly. So I think now's a good time to open it out to the floor for some questions for any of our panel, either sort of directly about what you've heard this evening, or related examples you'd like to explore through the themes we've already discussed. Raise your hand digitally or in the time-honoured fashion to camera if you have a question. Or if not, we can pick up some of the themes in a bit more detail.
If no one has, can I be really presumptuous and ask a further question, please?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. And it's leading on, but with a slight slant from Rachel's prompt earlier on, who asked about measuring success. I just wondered whether each of the case studies could talk about not measuring success specifically, but measuring impact, and actually perhaps exploring the difference between success and impact. Sounds like a job interview. I'm really sorry.
There's a scoring matrix at the end. Should we run through in order? John, then Rachel, then Mark. Sorry, John, to put you on the spot.
Nope.
No?
Sorry, I can. Yeah, Zoom gave up on me. Sorry. I think in Barking and Dagenham, the repurposing of heritage assets isn't an ambition. You know, the ambition is to build 44,000 new homes. So it's not a thing that's obviously being measured, say, by the local authority, for instance. I think the fact that the RSA's heritage index says that there's high heritage potential in Barking and Dagenham is basically a sign that there's not enough being done with the heritage assets that are there. For the work that's taking place with intangible heritage and telling new and different stories about the borough, I don't think that's a deliberate thing necessarily, or it's not the primary aim of the work of the Everyone Everyday project necessarily. Their aim is different, but incidental to their work is the fact that they're telling new stories about the place, and their whole project has been set up as a 5-year experiment. They've got tons of their budget allocated to evaluation. They're hoping to publish their 5-year end of project evaluation soon. So I guess we'll find out, whether they think they've been successful in their approach. I think the biggest difference that they're trying to sort of promote is, rather than is our project a success, have we created an entire new system where people feel like they've got agency over where they live? So they've taken it, a scale beyond a project that looks to deliver a set of outcomes. To have they created the infrastructure that enables local people to run their own projects, to shape the public realm, to shape buildings, to shape sense of community and connections, with their neighbours. So I don't know if that's necessarily helpful, but I suppose that's where I've ended up.
Can you dive in just there on Catherine's question? It's not a problem if it isn't something that you've covered. Yeah, so that the MUF project with the street corners was something that Everyone Everyday was involved in and supported. They ran the process to get particular designers selected and to get the community involved.
It's hard not to see transforming a couple of street corners as relatively small fry compared to electing 12 BNP councillors. So I found it really tricky looking at Barking and Dagenham as a case study, particularly in terms of scale, I guess. When you're thinking about, has it been successful? What scale are you looking at? And I'm not sure I have an answer yet.
Thanks, John. Rachel?
Something I was thinking about when you asked that question was we recently had a discussion in a university meeting about the difference between knowledge exchange and impacts. And knowledge exchange could be something that's quite anecdotal, whereas impacts about sort of closing the loop and, you know, getting feedback. But it's so hard with a lot of these projects to have feedback. You know, the Broken Angel project, they're not recording, you know, how many visitors are coming through because people are sort of just passing through all the time. Some people might see it at night when they're going past the cathedral and not coming in. You know, there are no sort of formal feedback forms, but, you know, then does that make it irrelevant if we have no feedback and we can't close that loop? I think it's a really difficult question, especially going back to those points about scale and whether something's temporary, because, you know, will everyone just forget about this project in 5-10 years time? Does that mean that it hasn't had an impact? Has it had an impact on particular individuals, particular groups? I don't know. I think it's almost an impossible question to answer. And the other thing that struck me as well was City of Culture, the way that a lot of local artists I was speaking to spoke about City of Culture. It was almost like it sort of swept in, and, you know, the focus was very much on sort of performing arts and these sort of temporary things, and then it's just sort of left again. And a lot of the artists, as I say, who I spoke to, they felt like there's no sort of permanent exhibition spaces for them to display their work, which is why, you know, the Lytton Tree, which I mentioned, was informally set up. And that came back to the Birmingham issue, because a lot of them said, well, if I'm a serious artist and I want to display my work, I'll just go to Birmingham because there's no space for me in Coventry. So I'm not sure if that answers your question really, but I think it probably opens up more questions than it closes down.
And Mark, do you have anything further to add about the difference between success and impact in the Sunderland example?
Well, I mean, coming from an academic background, where of course there's a lot of talk about impact in terms of, you know, you want research to have impact because that is often seen as justifying the value of the research to start off with. I mean, a lot of it comes back to, you know, how do you measure it? How do you possibly assess it? I think it's, you know, the same questions can be asked about success, can't they? And you know, Catherine's put a very relevant point in the chat about, you know, success in terms of the levelling up agenda is not on a kind of quantitative scale, but is more to do with things like pride in place and so on. I mean, just thinking about the, you know, just those buildings in Sunderland and, you know, what the impact could be of those things or is. I mean, I suppose the first thing that strikes me is that, you know, with that middle building, you now have a new community resource which did not exist before and is clearly being quite well used. So, you know, there's a new music venue that wasn't there before. There's a new community resource that's being used by children for various things. So that, you know, that's definitely an impact in terms of, you know, a new resource being available. Something else that came out of a chance conversation I had with somebody while I was up in Sunderland, but there's also a visual impact, which, you know, in a way might touch on this thing about, you know, pride in place. That's one of these kind of sort of levelling up things. Because I bumped into somebody who's working on programs to do with developing heritage skills in the city, in relation to these kinds of refurbishment projects. And she was saying that she used to drive past, or perhaps still does drive past, that location a lot. And of course, for years, she was driving past some derelict buildings, and she was aware of their history, their heritage, and she had a sense, which was completely justified, that were these buildings going to fall down? Because actually the middle building, the one that used to be the bins shop, had been modified by bins in such a way as to make the structure rather, well, almost literally shaky. They took out floors and weakened the structure. So, there was this thing of like, are these buildings going to collapse? And so seeing that on a regular basis, and then now being able to drive past and you see buildings that are definitely not going to collapse and, present a sort of very bright, optimistic front to the street, is another kind of impact, which I think, certainly this person was sort of taking a lot of heart from, because, rather than sort of being concerned about something, you no longer are, and see something that's quite sort of positive and forward looking and optimistic. And I suppose the other thing, which is perhaps smaller, is that middle building now has a plaque on it, a blue plaque, a city council blue plaque, that celebrates another aspect of the history, which is that bins were Quakers and refused to deal in goods that were known to have been produced by slave labour. So that there's now another strand to that building's history that has been made public. So there is as well as sort of restoration of heritage, there's also a bit of public history there in the form of, a bit of information right on the front of the building. So I don't know how you measure those things, but yeah, there are definitely effects.
I wonder, Catherine Croft, not Clark, whether you can say a little bit about the 20th Century Society as far as looking at sort of success and impacts concerned. You talked right at the start about the need to get in early at the beginning and try and have more influence on these reuse schemes. But we're talking now about once they're completed and how do we measure whether they've made a decent go of it? Is that something that the society take an interest in? No? Right. I've lost Catherine briefly. Okay, not to worry. Does anyone else have any further questions?
There was a hand raised.
Hi, yeah.
Maxine.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. Yes, just wanted to say that it's been really interesting. I'm fascinated. It's great we're having a discussion about this all, because I feel it's all quite new. As you were saying at the beginning, the government has recognised that I think heritage in this country is an asset that we have, and that's new, and they are putting money there. But it's then how we link that to the bigger picture of the economy, and then also I think a balance between looking at the cities as an individual and getting involved in the local community, getting people involved in to have their say, to take ownership of it. Then maybe a balance between looking at the bigger pictures in life of, I don't know, since we've got loneliness has come up with COVID and so on, an aging population, mental health, the sort of bigger pictures of the problems we've got in society, diversity, which is, has been a great change recently, people coming together much more recognise that. So it's whether we can link it to bigger pictures of the country, but also then at the local level, what the individual places have to say themselves about it and taking some ownership of it. And a lot of people do have time on their hands with aging population. That's, something to think about. And also universities, I feel that's talking about Catherine from the 20th Century Society, maybe educating people about what they have and celebrating what they have with them, but at the same time having a balance to listen to what they've got to say. So I think we're all at the beginning with this. So it's just great that we're having this discussion, and with these case studies as well, that, it's fascinating. So yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you. Catherine Croft, do you want to try again? I think we had a little technical gremlin. It would be quite nice as we sort of bring this to a close to look again at sort of measuring success and at what point you sort of leave the conversation.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, you're back.
Oh, I've pulled the plug out and shoved it in again. Yeah, I mean, I think we find it incredibly difficult to measure impact because, I mean, you know, particularly with dealing with listed building consents, you know, do we count up the number of schemes that we've objected to that then don't get listed building consent, or the percentage of the points that we make about an application that are revised before consent is given? Or do we look at what percentage of the buildings that we put forward for listing are actually listed? And none of those feel like particularly helpful measures, because quite often I think what we're doing is trying to just a much slower process of turning around hearts and minds. And it's very often that we, you know, that a scheme will go away, there will be a long period of reflection and then a kind of regrouping. No developer is ever going to say, as from my experience, oh, thank you so much, 20th Century Society, you know, you gave me a great idea and I'll change my mind and do that. They go off in a massive sulk and come back 3 years later. And I think quite a lot of our campaigning is also about really just trying to bring both local government and central government into a kind of broader awareness of you know, the sorts of interest in post-war buildings that is becoming increasingly manifest on social media, and particularly on Instagram. You know, how you kind of get that kind of cultural shift in front of decision makers, and in front of, you know, in front of developers who ultimately we want to be putting their money and their confidence in taking on projects. So but I think in terms of public appreciation and public response to projects, it's really, really hard for us to think about how we might measure impact that in that way.
Thank you, Catherine. And impact is an ideal place really for us to draw this to a close. I might just hand over to Catherine Clark to give a couple of thoughts on where we might go from here. This is obviously a very targeted, very small scale project, but it's an absolutely enormous subject and incredibly timely. So Catherine, if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I don't really have very much to say other than, well, I know you'll be thanking everyone, Matt, but, you know, just to quickly get in my thanks to all our speakers for your wonderful insights this evening. I think what's really clear from what everyone has been saying who's been part of this conversation are the opportunities here, the potential for work in this area, and what's at stake. So I was really struck by, you know, Maxine, when you came into the discussion and you said that this is new. I mean, we are kind of breaking new ground in a lot of this conversation, whether it's thinking about the new ways that that the success of these projects are being kind of measured and thought about through the language of the Levelling Up white paper, kind of foregrounding pride and emotion and affective response and experience and well-being, and the questions that opens up for us in terms of how we gauge that and how we engage with that. And I think, you know, being based in the humanities as we are, we should be distinctively well placed to do that. And Owen's comment that, you know, how important it is that we get it right. I mean, right back in his opening presentation, Owen talks about the opportunity, but also the risk as well. There's a lot at stake. And I think this conversation has really showed how this concept of creative repurposing, as we've sort of figured it today, opens up such a constellation of questions, not just around the built environment and buildings, but around local cultures and identities, around kind of geographies, really. We came to that question of kind of centres and peripheries and zonings, both within places and between places, and the role of specific buildings as a part of that, within that, but only as one piece of that. So I don't really want to say any more, Matt, other than I hope we continue this conversation, and I think there is work to be done. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. So at exactly 7 o'clock, it really only remains for me to thank our 3 researchers who have uncovered an incredible amount of rich detail and information in a ridiculously short time frame, and have driven this project along wonderfully in such a way that Catherine and I have just been able to sit back and watch their achievements roll in, which has been excellent. And also to our two guest panelists, to Catherine and to Owen, for sort of broadening out the discussion and giving so much expert insight. And to everyone who's attended, thank you for coming along to this special one-off summer seminar, and do keep your eyes peeled for the programme for the Centre for the History of People, Place and Community seminar, which will be released very shortly for the autumn term. Thank you once again.